Hi, everyone. Welcome to I-CBT Friday discussion group. We are a group of clinicians who meet regularly on Fridays to share information about learning I-CBT, expand awareness, and have healthy discussion. So thanks for being here and being part of this. I'm Mary Hosbrough, and I'm one of the co-facilitators along with Margaret McCall and Sylvie Levine. And we are currently alternating special topics presentations on some Fridays and general I-CBT discussions on others. If you want to see some of the special topics presentations that we've already done or presentations on the I-CBT modules, you can find those recordings on the I-CBT YouTube channel or I-CBT Online. And I will drop the links for those in the chat once we get started. But today we do have another presentation. We are going to have Lauren Spencer speaking with us about differentiating GAD and OCD using I-CBT. If you have questions during her presentation, I'm going to ask that you drop them in the chat, and I will try to grab the questions that are about specifics as we move along and hold more general questions to the end. Please be mindful that we are recording this, so don't share any specific client information or details where clients could be identified. And there will also likely be time at the end for folks to unmute or ask questions or comment directly. So we will welcome Lauren. Lauren Spencer, LMFT, is a private practice therapist serving Washington State. She specializes in helping women professionals overcome anxiety, OCD, and relational concerns. She offers an online course for loved ones of those who have OCD to equip them to decrease family accommodation and enhance their own self-care. She also offers webinars on the subjects of GAD and OCD and overviews of the treatment modalities available for OCD. Her lived experience with OCD and having her OCD treated like it was GAD has made her passionate about providing clinicians with clarity as to why it is vital they know the difference between these two disorders. So I will drop a link to her website in the chat, as well as the other I-CBT resources that I usually include, like the I-CBT website and YouTube channel and clinician's manual. So please feel free to hop on over to her website to look at any of her offerings. So we will turn it over to Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That was fantastic. Okay, I'm going to share my screen and we will get going. Let's do this. Okie dokes. Yeah, so as she just said, we're going to talk about the difference between generalized anxiety and OCD and why we all need to know the difference. My guess is a lot of you here will know a good chunk of what we're going to talk about today, which is fantastic. So please feel free to share any epiphanies that you have in the chat. And as Mary said, I will try to answer ones that are questions if they come up that are specific to what we're currently talking about, and then overview questions we can leave for the end. So a tiny bit about me. This is my background in case you're curious. One thing I didn't mention in kind of my little overview is I also provide couples counseling, which has been a fun crossover for my relationship OCD concerns clients. And then also, as we all know, OCD impacts the whole family system. So a lot of times I end up working with couples who one of the individuals has OCD. And so that's been a really cool niche for me to explore. But okay, what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to start with just an overview of what is OCD, and then we're going to do an overview of what GAD is, and then we're going to talk about how do we differentiate those two, and I'll talk some assessment tools. I have 3 steps that I personally walk through with clients, and so hopefully those 3 steps will also be helpful to you. Okay, so just the nitty-gritty overview of OCD, just according to the DSM-5, we're looking for persistent thoughts, urges and images. I always like to highlight the urges and images component because sometimes those get missed. They are experienced as intrusive, unwanted, and cause a lot of distress. The individual then, of course, attempts to ignore them, tries to get rid of them. And this is really time consuming. It's also significantly distressing. The behaviors that they do to try to get rid of those intrusive thoughts or unwanted urges, whatever it is for them, those are the compulsions, which can be repetitive behaviors, or of course, mental acts. And the mental acts, in my practice, see a lot more frequently than repetitive physical behaviors, but obviously there can be both. And those are done directly in response to the obsession and trying to either prevent the bad thing from happening or just reduce distress. And those things are excessive or not connected realistically. Very basic cycle that hopefully, if you're an ERP clinician, same kind of cycle idea, same with I-CBT. So this is very basic, but generally speaking, we'll see a trigger, and then an obsession develops that leads anxiety to climb. And then of course, the compulsions are an attempt to bring down the anxiety. Okay, I'm gonna run through some basic obsessions, common obsessions, real quick, since most of you probably know a lot of these. But we've got contamination themes and just right themes, I would say, are still probably the most common, like, known about when we think OCD. But they don't often look the way that people think that they look unless they treat OCD. So with contamination, it can be the classic, germs, but also it can look like, what if I get contaminated and that hurts, my baby if they're pregnant, or a person can be contaminated in their mind, like those types of things. And of course, illness is a big one here. Just right is also really commonly thought of with OCD, but it doesn't necessarily look organized. Sometimes the house might look like absolutely chaotic to somebody who doesn't have their obsessions, but things have to be in a particular order for them, or a feeling, like, so just have to feel right. Relationship OCD. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like I'm seeing kind of like an uptick in this presentation. I don't know if that's just my own clients, but with this one, it's a lot of, am I with the right person? What if I don't love them enough? What if we divorce in the future? And so this can also really show up in couples counseling. So a fun one for me to work with. And then we've got sex and sexuality. These are two different obsessions, but for sex, we've got fear of being perverted, fear of being a sexual deviant, just unwanted sexual thoughts. And then we've got also obsessions around sexuality, sexual identity, not knowing, what their true identity is, and that, leading to some catastrophic kind of event. A lot of times I see these two kind of being connected, can show up of, what if I don't know that I'm actually gay, but I'm married to this person, and what would that mean for them? Then, of course, religious and themes, we often talk about them like scrupulosity. If I'm remembering correctly, the first recorded cases of OCD were religious monks who were doing things excessively. And if monks are doing religious activities excessively, like, that's pretty excessive. So this can look like fear of blaspheming, or fear of going to hell, offending their higher power, being possessed, anything that's kind of in whatever their religion is, obsessing about that. Harm and suicide. I always like to include suicidal obsessions because that's different from being suicidal, which can understandably be really muddy waters. But for someone who has the fear of becoming suicidal or obsessions around that, it's not that they have the intent to hurt themselves or the desire to hurt themselves. It's more of that, like, but what if I did? Right? Like, what if I accidentally harm myself? Or what if I've had a client in the past who's had obsessions around sleepwalking and that leading to harm, right? And so this is really more of like the fear of suicide rather than the desire to have that kind of escape. And then harm, of course, is fear of harming somebody else, whether it's accidentally or purposefully. With a lot of, I just think of a lot of like negligent, vulnerable self themes with these ones. That's the first thing my brain goes to. But yeah, can be purposeful harm, can be accidental harm, but that's a really common one. And then, of course, pedophilia themes. What if I hurt a kid? What if I touch a kid inappropriately? See this a lot with, you know, the teachers and the nurses and, you know, the people who just adore kids. And this one can be really tied with postpartum as well, which I'm hopeful that there starts to become a little bit more of a known thing of postpartum OCD. I feel like postpartum anxiety is becoming more known, so maybe OCD is like the next wave. But this would be obsessions around harm coming to their baby, them causing harm to their baby, contaminating themselves, causing harm to the baby, all of that. I think there's a statistic that just kind of came out of like over 70% of new moms that have intrusive thoughts. And so we're looking for like how many intrusive thoughts are they having? Are they doing the compulsions? That type of thing. And then the last one I'll just highlight is the fear of going crazy or fear of it or doubting whether or not it's actually OCD. What if it's schizophrenia? What if I have bipolar? That type of thing. Or the what if I go crazy? Like, what if I snap and do something, you know, crazy? Common compulsions. I think this is kind of the first component that can be muddy with GAD. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But compulsions are not just physical, they can also be mental. Majority appear to be mental because of this column right here. But a big one that we see with OCD is avoidance, but avoiding things due to those intrusive thoughts, due to the doubt of those intrusive thoughts being true. Inferential confusion, all of that, right? But so we'll see a lot of avoidance behaviors. We also see avoidance behaviors in GAD, generalized anxiety. So the key that we'll be talking about is why are they avoiding something? Checking behavior is really common. This can be mentally checking, so like checking for arousal, or checking things like, did I turn off the stove? Confessions, I see this, or this shows up for my clients a lot in couples counseling, but also kiddos. Can also be really sneaky where, you know, they'll kind of say a thought just casually and see how the other person reacts to it to kind of gauge if it's normal or not. So it's not always like overtly confessing. But it can be. They might be going to confessional. So we've got repeating, counting, washing. Most people are familiar with that within OCD. Seeking reassurance. I personally think like these two are like the biggest compulsions that people with OCD do. I know that was true for me, but this can be reassuring yourself, like, no, I'm not a bad person, or I would never do that, or everything's fine. It can also look like seeking reassurance from somebody else, checking in with them, seeing if they think you're a bad person, seeing if they think you're gay, whatever it is. Praying can become compulsive. So with this one, we're looking at like why are they praying, and are they doing it excessively? Are they doing it in response to those intrusive thoughts, trying to make the doubt go away? If it's something that their religion across the board kind of employs, or again, if it's excessive. So if they're doing it because it's a values-based behavior, not compulsive. And then ruminating, like I said, this column can get wishy-washy with GAD. I think it's also the most common compulsions that we see with OCD though. So ruminating, I like to think of as like, if you wouldn't be thinking about this thing, if you hadn't just had that thought, or if you weren't doubting, you're probably ruminating. And so this one can be really tricky because it feels like they're just thinking, right? Totally understandable, because it feels like they're just thinking about something. But if they're doing it because they're doubting something, we're looking at ruminating. In GAD, people will also ruminate, but I like to think of it as worry versus ruminating. To highlight a couple more, mental review. This can also like lead to false memory OCD, but going back, replaying events, social settings, whatever it is for them, to see if they acted inappropriately or if they were socially adept, whatever it is. And then I also had to put Dr. Google, because I think all of our clients at some point have used Google as their therapist and doctor, and Google told them that they were going to die. So this one obviously will show up with health anxiety a lot, but also can be really about any kind of obsession. It's almost like they're confessing their thoughts to Google and seeing what it says. Okay. 3 key points to remember about OCD specifically. Obsessions can be about anything. So while, yes, that is a decent list of obsessions, it's more about how their brain is working, which we'll talk about that inferential confusion piece in a bit. But it's that doubt and the intrusive thoughts component that and then the compulsions that they're trying to use to get rid of them. Please note that only about 30% of OCD sufferers have contamination themes, so they can really be about anything. Compulsions can be physical or mental. And then always want to highlight that obsessions are ego dystonic. The obsessional content is scary as heck because they don't want any of that to be true. So it goes against their values and against who they are. Okay, switching gears to generalized anxiety. I really like just looking at the visual of the two DSM diagnoses, just because they're actually pretty different. And one thing that I noticed is that the symptoms of GAD are actually a lot of physical emphasis is put on that. So with GAD, we're looking at anxiety and worry about a myriad of things. I like to focus on the worry component. I think that's, at least for me, I think thinking of GAD as just worriers helps me conceptualize it a bit. They're having a hard time not worrying. And then the symptoms, like I mentioned, a lot of them are physical. So we're looking at like restlessness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, sleep disturbance, muscle tension, right? We've got irritability, of course, and worry. But other than that, we do want to be looking for physical components when people are talking about how much they're worrying too, before we're going to diagnose them with GAD. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple visuals that will hopefully be helpful. I'm a visual learner, so for anyone out there, hopefully this helps you too. So in differentiating these diagnoses, think of like an emotion as a bell curve. It's going to naturally rise, it's going to naturally peak, and then it's going to naturally fall. This applies to most every emotion. The baseline level is going to differ based on whether anxiety is present. And then we'll talk about what I like to call the roller coaster from hell down here. So for someone who like has a presentation at work, it would be completely understandable for them to have some stress kind of uptick. If they don't have an anxiety disorder, their baseline is going to be really, really low. Maybe a 1, maybe a 0. Lucky them, right? So they're gonna have their stress level gradually climb. It's probably gonna peak right around the start time of the presentation, and then it's gonna naturally come down. Okay, so for generalized anxiety, the way that I like to think of it as is basically their baseline jumps up. So depending on the severity of their GAD, their baseline might be a 4, it might be a 6. But what happens then is it doesn't take as much external things happening to get the worry to like a really uncomfortable level of anxiety, right? And if they don't feel like they could control the worry, that's really distressing. So if they have the presentation, but they're starting at a 4, they might end up at an 8 pretty quick, right? But it's still a bell curve. It's still going to kind of naturally rise and then naturally fall. Like I said, with OCD, I like to call it the roller coaster from hell, not a pretty bell curve. Just like with GAD, though, it's going to have a baseline that is higher than 0. Depending, again, on the severity, it might be a 4, it might be a 6, whatever, right? But because of the way that the OCD brain is wired, and that, again, inferential confusion piece, which we'll talk about in a second, when there's a trigger, the anxiety jumps pretty high, pretty dang fast. If we think of like the sequence in like the I-CBT world, it can happen in like milliseconds, and they're already really, really high on anxiety scales. So up here, their brain says, oh my gosh, we cannot tolerate this. This is the most awful thing ever. This is terrifying. Let's do something to get rid of this, right? And so that's where compulsions come in. Let's say they reassure themselves, okay? So they bring the anxiety down for a second. This is pretty generous for how much it comes down. But let's say they bring the anxiety down. The problem is that their brain is still wired the same way. So down here, they're going to have another doubt. They're going to get sucked into the bubble again. They're going to have a what if thought, the crossover points, all of that is going to happen, and it's going to shoot right back up. And so they're going to ride this terrible roller coaster all day, every day. And so the goal is to get them back to a pretty bell curve of emotion, with a baseline that is not, not a 6. We want it to be a lower baseline. And then this one I borrow from John Hirschfield's, when a family member has OCD, but I like the visual. So I like to think of the brain as a person standing on a stage and they're under a spotlight. Someone who does not have OCD, they're going to have a nice narrow spotlight over them. So only the relevant information is going to be lit up like a beacon, and they're also going to have a nice filtration system. The weird, wacky human thoughts, the irrelevant thoughts, all hang out in the outskirts. But because their brain doesn't light it up, they don't notice them nearly as much, right? Their brain's not turning on the alarm signal when those even show up. But let's say one does kind of get over here. They've got this nice filter that says, that's irrelevant. That doesn't matter. We're going to pop out, right? That's not based in reality. We're going to shoot that back out there. Lucky them. So for someone who has OCD, I like to call it a floodlight. They don't have a spotlight. Their brain is just all lit up, trying to identify any threat, right? Any threat that will come in the way of intrusive thoughts and doubting whether or not those thoughts are true. They also don't have the filter. And so I kind of like to think of reality sensing as building a filter for their brain. But what this means is that if a thought is lit up, their brain is going to think that it's relevant and important and that they need to act on it. So another visual. All right, so in the chat, could you drop down either some ideas of what the problem could be between if a therapist were to treat an OCD client the same way as GAD? Maybe you've got lived experience with that like me, but take a second. What do you think could the problems be?
The therapist reassuring the client, offering reassurance.
Reassurance is such a big one. Challenging the classic CBT model, right? Challenging thoughts. That's basically just mentally reviewing a thought, which is compulsive. Any other ideas? I mean, those are kind of
they're not seeing the obsessional reasoning process that's creating the doubts in the first place. They're not catching the imaginal absorption, all of the I-CBT things that would really be the things that we would be targeting if we're doing I-CBT treatment.
Yes, totally.
Missing the point with the client. Though I find this more problematic in addressing GAD instead of OCD. OCD instead of GAD.
Interesting. Yes. Replacing, but yeah, like positive thinking, right? That can be a problematic thing for OCD. Yeah, I like to think of it as basically talk therapy is ruminating with the client, right? A lot of times it's like, oh, well, where do you think that thought came from? Or why do you think you had that thought? And not in a way that's trying to like figure out the obsessional sequence or the logic that their brain is using. It's more of like a, tell me about your family of origin, right? Like those types of things or relational components, which has its place, but can be, finding the root, finding the dang root. That was my problem with my therapist, and it didn't work great. Thank God for OCD treatment, but yes, so lots of problems. Buying into compulsive. Yes, reassurance. That's a great thing. Yeah, reassurance itself isn't. You can answer any question once, right? It's when it becomes over and over that reassuring that's problematic. But yeah, y'all got it. Fantastic. Lots of reassurance problems, lots of rumination problems. Okay, so where things have gone wrong historically that I think has led to a lot of this confusion. First of all, it used to be considered an anxiety disorder, which is totally understandable because there's so much anxiety with OCD, right? But I think that's led therapists to kind of make the assumption of, if they get a client who they think has OCD, they're like, oh, well, it's an anxiety disorder. I treat anxiety, therefore I can totally work with OCD. Problematic, right? But I can totally understand why that jump would be made. Then, of course, we've got the societal stigmas and stereotypes of OCD that have, for some reason, just really penetrated our vernacular. Things like obsessive Christmas disorder, or I'm so OCD, or I just like things organized. Not helpful for getting a good understanding of what OCD is. And then the lack of teaching in grad school programs. My grad school, when I went through the program, I got like a paragraph on OCD, maybe a 10-minute talk on it if you're lucky. So again, people just don't know that it takes kind of more of a specific training background to work with, rather than, of course, if someone was freshly out of grad school and had no extra training on like treating schizophrenia, they probably wouldn't work with it, right? But because the assumption that it's just an anxiety disorder, then oftentimes it does get treated like that. So this can all lead to, of course, misdiagnosis, mistreatment, clients not knowing what's even going on and having a hard time articulating it. Most people in our world know the concept of anxiety. They don't know the concept of like inferential confusion or obsessions, or the fact that compulsions can be mental. And then, of course, the terrifying horror stories of clients telling stories or telling their thoughts to their therapist, their doubts to their therapist, and the therapist like calling CPS or checking them into the hospital or that type of thing. Not going to really make somebody want to tell a therapist their scary thoughts, right? So we're working on breaking all of these one step at a time. Okay, so this is why we are here. And so bear with me, we'll be on the slide for a second. But this is the 3 components that I use to assess and kind of differentiate between GAD and OCD for a client. Step 1 that I use as step 1 is just looking for that DSM unwanted thoughts and compulsions components. I think it can be helpful to, send those big long checklists or go through the checklist with clients, because I find a lot of times people might, if a obsessional theme is not causing them a lot of distress, they probably don't notice that it's an OCD thing. And so it can be helpful to kind of run through a big checklist, and then people start kind of having that aha moment of like, oh yeah, I do check the locks, right? It's never bothered me, but like I do check them all the time. Or didn't think about relationship OCD, but yes, I didn't know that was a thing, but that's definitely me. So I think it can be helpful to just start kind of getting clients to recognize like what components can be OCD. And of course, the big one of mental compulsions. A lot of times clients will be like, I'm stressed all the time. I'm thinking about this all the time, but I don't really do compulsions. So that's when we want to educate about, rumination and reassurance and confessing and all of that stuff. But I think it's a great place to start. I don't think it's where you want to end though, right? I like to think of it as like a baseline to get kind of your OCD spidey senses tingling, and if any red flags are popping up. Then I think the best next step is looking for the presence of inferential confusion. I think this is a really key component that I-CBT has really kind of stepped into a gap around assessment for OCD. And so it's one of the things that I've really liked communicating with like new clinicians because it kind of clicks, like the difference between GAD and OCD when we talk about this. So as a review, inferential confusion is when we act as if our imagination is actually happening. We act on imagined scenarios. And this happens when our imagination has triggered a doubt rather than our senses. So for example, let's go with the example of standing on a train platform. It's a pretty human thought to have the intrusive thought pop in your brain of, oh my gosh, what if I flung myself in front of the train, right? If we're thinking of it in like the logic sequence, standing on the platform is probably the trigger. The doubt could be, what if I flung myself in front of the train? So if someone who does not have OCD, and so in this case, probably GAD, had that thought, well, if they had nothing in reality that was indicating that they actually had any desire or that anything was they're not in a big crowd that's pushing them closer and closer to the edge, they're not going to entertain that thought for like one iota of a second. They might not even notice that they had it. And for OCD though, what we'll see is that they imagine that thought, oh my goodness, yeah, let's doubt that, right? What if I did? And so instead of just moving on with their life because reality doesn't say that they have any desire to do that, they take a couple steps back from the platform, right? Maybe they leave, maybe they don't take a train again for the rest of their life. And so that's them acting on an imagined scenario in reality. And this is why compulsions don't work, right? Because the problems are concocted in the imagination. And so anything that you do in reality isn't going to even address them because they're not real, right? So an additional component that I like to look for is how a person is doubting. Are they doubting reasonably or are they doubting obsessionally? So reasonable doubt is going to be triggered by the senses. Obsessional doubt is triggered by the imagination, right? So a common kind of GAD thing is, worrying about job performance, right? Especially for our high achievers who happen to have generalized anxiety. So let's say someone is really worried about being fired from their job and they're thinking about it constantly. They come to your office, they're telling you about it, and they're explaining they just got a pretty poor performance review, or they're explaining that their company is really struggling and they're talking about doing layoffs. That's probably going to be pretty dang reasonable to be worried about it, right? Now, they might be doing it excessively and we want to work on that, but reality is telling them, hey, this is a threat, right? You just kind of flunked a performance review and your company is doing layoffs. Someone who's doubting obsessionally might come and talk to you about how they're terrified of being fired, but they just had an outstanding performance review. They have a great relationship with their boss. Their company's thriving, and yet they're still doubting because their imagination has come up with this amazing OCD story telling them, like, actually, this is a really relevant doubt. We need to act on it. So another way to highlight this, a little bit more behavioral, would be, let's say someone's going to cross a street, they get to a stop sign, and they look both ways like the good pedestrian that they are, and they see a truck coming, and they have the doubt, or well, first they would be thinking, oh, look, they're not slowing down. They're going pretty dang fast, actually. And I can see that they're texting through the window. And so they have the doubt, what if they blow the stop sign and they could hit me, right? And so they don't cross the street. That's reasonable. And it would still have been reasonable even if the truck did slam on their brakes and stop at the stop sign. Reality still clued them in to say, hey, we might want to be safe here. They look like they are barreling down this road and they're not going to stop, right? Someone who's obsessionally doubting gets to the same stop sign and they don't see anything. They don't hear any cars. It is just them and the crickets and the stop sign. But they're looking both ways constantly and doubting whether or not they're going to get hit by a car. Right. So this is really different and from how I've seen a lot of GAD presentations versus OCD. GAD is still going to, generally speaking, be reasonable. I think I've heard that technically sometimes people with GAD can be inferentially confused. And so that's why, we want to look at all of these things. But I think this is kind of the biggest red flag waving in the wind for if it is OCD. And then the last component that I look for is the function of the safety behaviors. So what I've noticed is, generally speaking, with GAD, the safety behaviors are often experienced as pleasant. So what I mean by that is if someone had just had a really stressful day at work and they come home and they clean their whole house to make themselves feel better, right? It's very soothing. They probably enjoyed the process. Even list making can be a very soothing process. Well, generally speaking, OCD safety behaviors are experienced as uncomfortable or unwanted. They don't want to be spending as much time on them. They might think that they need to be, right? So like they might have a lot of pushback against stopping a compulsion, but that's because of the doubt feeling so real and the OCD bubble being so powerful, right? But the actual act of like constantly reassuring themselves or praying a million times a day or avoiding driving by a school, they don't actually want to be doing those things. And so I think that's another way to kind of look at, okay, are they doing this behavior because they like it? Are they doing this behavior because they're doubting something? And if they are doing the behavior because they're doubting something, that's when we want to loop back here. Is it a reasonable doubt? Is it obsessional? Is there inferential confusion present?
If you Lauren, there is a question in the chat about someone said, I'm curious in hearing more how you've heard inferential confusion shows up in GAD.
Oh, great question. I don't know a lot. I don't remember where I heard that. If it was in like the I-CBT Facebook group or something. So I don't personally have experience with that. I just wanted to say that it's technically possible because I'm pretty positive I heard that from a decently reliable source, but it's like minute. So unfortunately, I don't have a great expansion on that.
Maybe after your presentation, if someone else
has
more information, we can have that in the discussion part. Yeah, sorry.
No, pop that in there. Okay. Yeah, so if you combine all of these together, I think you'll have a pretty good way of kind of saying like, yeah, we're working with OCD versus we're working with GAD, right? Okay, and so then 2 more slides. Some additional tools for your toolbox while assessing. First and foremost is just a knowledge of OCD. I think that's the best thing that we can do, even if people aren't wanting to work with OCD and specialize in it, even if they have just a basic understanding of things like inferential confusion and like mental compulsions are a thing, we would be doing a lot better, right? With clients getting great care. For inferential confusion, of course, we've got the ICQ questionnaire. We've got Y-box if we're looking at the DSM diagnosis. So this is going to measure things like how much time are the compulsions taking up, how much distress are the obsessions causing. And then also, like I said a bit ago, I think it can be helpful to look at checklists and go through those with clients. The Y-box has a checklist, but I find it to be a little bit, I don't know if dated is the right word, but it doesn't cover more of like the taboo kind of subjects as well. Whereas Jonathan Grayson's, I know, ERP heavy book, but it has a massive list of obsessions. And then an additional thing that if the client is just kind of wondering about OCD, maybe it hasn't been something that you talked about a lot with them, I think a good place to start is the ADAA's simple online OCD questionnaire. It's just a good kind of starting ground, and it's super client language friendly. So these are further tools for your toolbox. And if you remember nothing else about assessment, remember that anxiety is present with OCD due to the intrusive thoughts / doubt, right? The doubting sequence, right? Compulsive behaviors are distressing, generally speaking, in OCD, even if they feel like they really need to be doing them, right? But safety behaviors tend to be soothing and experiences pleasant in GAD. And then, as I said before, inferential confusion is the main red flag waving in the wind for OCD. Resources, helpful websites and podcasts, helpful books. Let's see, social media, these ones talk I-CBT. I do have a social media account. It's not specific to I-CBT, but I do talk about I-CBT. And then this is me. Yeah, okay. I will stop sharing and look in. Oh, thanks, Mike. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren. Yeah, I think you're seeing now that Mike added a little bit of information about using the ICQ and the cutoff score of 92, that it can be present even just in non-pathological things or non-pathological thinking, and of course in other disorders as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then similar question under that, so what differentiates subclinical OCD from GAD, especially if we don't want to use severity as a psychometric?
Oh, subclinical OCD from GAD.
I think I've heard people say things like, oh, OCD is just GAD on steroids, or OCD is just extreme. Is that kind of what you're talking about, Nicole?
Hey, a little bit in terms of like you can have severe GAD and a less severe case of OCD. If we're if we're seeing inferential confusion as a definitive factor between the two, but a subclinical, we can still have inferential confusion at a subclinical level, then how do we differentiate? I guess we're not necessarily treating subclinical OCD often in our offices, but still, like, if I may be wrong, but I was just conceptualizing if inferential confusion is a definitive factor, but it still shows up in GAD, then that muddies the waters a bit. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair that would be muddy. It sounds like it's not as present with GAD, but if I had a client who came to me and was like, I have OCD, but like I've gotten treatment for it and it's, super, super minimal. And yet they also have a lot of like GAD symptoms, right? The physical components, the worry, then I think we would be working more on just the GAD component and whatever treatment modality that is for you. If that's ACT, maybe you do incorporate some I-CBT concept if you're noticing some inferential confusion processes, but I think then you'd be wanting to target more of the GAD work.
And Mike added a comment in the chat that might be helpful as well. Subclinical obsessional doubt doesn't become normal doubt.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Like we can still determine what's reasonable versus obsessional doubt then. Yeah.
Okay, not to make it even muddier, but sorry. I think this is a really interesting topic. And so I've been kind of debating this quite a bit too. But if you're having subclinical obsessional doubt, my guess is your only form of doubts is not just obsessional doubt. So you're going to also have normal doubts. And an obsessional brain is really good at finding those outliers. And so just trying to conceptualize then kind of where you draw that line, because you're gonna, if you're subclinical OCD, you're not only having obsessional doubts, you're also having relative doubts in 90-95% or however many other areas of your life. It's just in these slices that it's obsessional. Does that make sense?
I think so. I mean, my thought then is if like they're not having that inferential confusion piece, we'd want to be working on the excessive worry. Because I mean, people with OCD, right, they can have reasonable doubts outside of their obsessional content. But then we're not treating those because they're not inferentially confused around those.
Yeah, I think my question is just like trying to resolve if inferential confusion is a differentiating factor, then where do we draw the line if it also shows up in GAD? Because severity alone doesn't necessarily give us that metric, depending on, we might have higher severity around a relative doubt versus an obsessional doubt. It's all very confusing, but I appreciate your thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that's where, like, for me personally, like I do go through things like, you know, the Y box, the Y box checklists, like looking for the unwanted obsessional content and the compulsion piece. Like I'm not just using I-CBT, inferential confusion, right? It's one red flag. I personally think it's the best red flag, but I don't think it's the only red flag.
I have something to add that I'm not sure if it'll be helpful or not, but is that okay? I'm thinking about when we're defining inferential confusion, and trying to really see how the doubts are constructed. And the what's coming to my mind is the way that Fred and Bronwyn and Katie had created components of inferential confusion. So if we're just defining it really basically as mistaking an imagined possibility for a real probability, then whether we're talking about differential diagnosis or treatment, we could still go with like trying to target the anxiety and the compulsion component. But if we're getting even more specific, trying to see how the doubt is constructed and looking for things like the over-reliance on possibility, distrust of the senses, and what's the third one that my mind is drawing a blank right now. Bronwyn, help me out.
Irrelevant associations, distrust
Irrelevant
of the
associations.
senses, self, and
Yes.
over-reliance on possibility.
So then your presentation, Lauren, has me thinking like, yes, and then if we can really, really refine and look for the inferential confusion in those ways as well, then we are able to see it more clearly. And then that also like might help us differentiate, and it helps us kind of target what treatment approach we want to use.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't know if that helps with you, what you're thinking about too, Nicole.
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful. And I think we as clinicians probably get caught up on it more than the clients, because their goal is to want to feel better. As a clinician, I will say, just with lived experience myself, I see the negative in terms of just treating GAD if it's actually OCD. And so really, as I've come to understand OCD better, it's been harder to differentiate GAD away from that. So I've kind of flip-flopped on that, but it's I think it's a helpful discussion. And ultimately, if we don't lose goal of the client and what they need, and we're treating the symptom presentation, whether we call it GAD or OCD, it's about helping the client make that goal. So it may be even like a technicality that my brain likes to get hooked up on it, but it's helpful, and I appreciate your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I like what Mike just said. Like GAD is about a problematic response, but the doubt was normal. And so treatment isn't going to be focused on the doubt. It's going to be focused on the response. I think that was super clear in my mind. I liked that. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a really good discussion. I mean, it highlights the importance of this topic, Lauren.
It's a hot topic, but for good reason. So hopefully it stays a hot topic so we can all learn more.
Lauren, I'm curious. Can I ask you? And I'm sorry, y'all. I can shut up too if more people are like, I want to say something. But I'm curious. Before you understood inferential confusion, how would have you differentiated the two? And if so, what would have been? Because I think for people coming from a predominantly ERP perspective, not understanding inferential confusion would be harder to differentiate. And so, how would someone coming from that model's kind of, I don't know, mindset be able to understand and appreciate the differences if they're not aware of the inferential confusion piece?
So I mean, prior to learning I-CBT, I focused really heavily on that first box, looking for, things like taboo subjects, things that like that obsessional content, but also really diving into like compulsions and providing a lot of psychoeducation around what compulsions actually are, and kind of working with the client to identify those. So I was very like DSM, right? And so I think people coming from the ERP background, I mean, you have the benefit of knowing that component really well, which is fabulous. I think this is an additional tool to help kind of provide some certainty, which I love that I'm using certainty with ERP people, but that can provide a little bit more clarity around like, okay, this is not just GAD really high avoidance, right? Or they're just ruminating, but like, no, they also have this inferential confusion point. It's probably not GAD. So yeah, that was how I used it. I kind of would assume a lot of ERP folks would have just been in kind of that DSM section. But I think this offers more clarity, more certainty. So yeah.
Lauren, I'm wondering if you have any, like if you see comorbid, both of these conditions together, and then any tips for explaining that to clients and client-facing language, or like the focus of treating the rumination response for the reasonable doubts versus undoing some of the obsessive doubts for the OCD, or anything along those lines.
Yeah, I think so. For me personally, if someone was coming with OCD and GAD, and we kind of established both of those are going on, I'm going to start with the OCD side of things, to get that, like, to get everything in the reasonable doubt world, right? To kind of clear that up, so that then we can actually identify like what worry is coming up for you that's not related to obsessional doubt. And that's when I switch gears into ACT. That's my favorite component. I also see a lot of times clients, like after they've done a lot of work around I-CBT, they really recognize, they recognize their stuff and they're getting a lot better. Then I find we actually kind of switch into like a grief processing spot too. And so again, that's not at all obsessional doubt. It's more of like just being super upset that they even went through the OCD diagnosis. And so I find I do a lot of grief work too. And that's when we would also switch into more of like the GAD kind of, okay, this is an obsessional, let's talk about values-based living and processing worry and that type of thing. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? We really appreciate you presenting with us and taking all these questions and sharing this discussion with us, Lauren.
Love talking about this. It's like my favorite thing. So thanks for having me. Thank you everybody for your questions and your input. Here's to not ruminating with our clients.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to stop recording.